Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his remarks, and particularly his great overview of the history of safe tanker traffic off Canada's Pacific coast, Mr. Speaker. We hear a lot of rhetoric and clearly a lot of confusion from some members about regular marine accidents where a vessel might spill some of its diesel or some of its own petroleum products. That's very much different than an oil tanker, which is designed to actually transport crude oil or diluted bitumen or a range of petroleum products. And there have been no accidents on the Pacific coast. And in fact, multiple governments of both Liberal and Conservative stripe have continued over the last few decades to modernize marine navigation, to modernize regulatory regimes and safeguards. So I think the unblemished record will not only continue, but has been enhanced by Canada's world-class regime. My remarks on C-48 are going to really touch on two things, and I think when Canadians go to the polls in 2019, they're going to assess the Prime Minister. Before, they just knew him as the celebrity son of a previous Prime Minister, and he had no record in the private sector, no record in the nonprofit sector, no record in academia, no record really of any note in his days as a member of Parliament of this place. So he ran and won on a celebrity record. Now they're going to judge him on his performance, whether it's broken promises on the deficit, whether it's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment fleeing Canada, whether it's our competitiveness, which literally every bank and economic forecaster in recent months have said is at real risk with changes in the U.S. and Canada increasing taxes, the U.S. lowering taxes. They're going to judge him on his record. And nowhere is this Prime Minister's record worse than on First Nation issues, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there's some laughter coming from their benches. The Prime Minister has a tattoo of the Haida Nation on his shoulders, but I can't say one thing he's done for that nation or any other nation, Mr. Speaker. The missing and murdered Indigenous inquiry has been a disaster from start to finish. There's been no clarity for the families that were promised certainty. There's been departures of people leaving. They're now asking for twice as much time, twice as much budget. The Prime Minister promised to heal and to drive us towards reconciliation, but he's not done that. And on this file, you might say, why am I speaking about this when it comes to the tanker moratorium in Bill C-48? Because I'll quote a chief from the Buffalo Lake Métis, Elmer Ghostkeeper, that when the Prime Minister unilaterally and not following science or regulatory approvals cancelled the Northern Gateway pipeline, and this moratorium bill is essentially a way of blocking that ever coming back, he said this, quote, "Equity was offered to Aboriginal communities, and with the change in government, that was taken away," end quote. Another leader from that area, First Nation, the Gitxsan First Nation, Elmer Derrick, said, quote, "The fact that the Prime Minister chose not to consult with the people in northwest British Columbia disappointed us very much," end quote, Mr. Speaker. In fact, 31 bands across that route were going to be 30% equity holders in that line with Enbridge, Mr. Speaker. Unilaterally, the Prime Minister of Canada took away economic opportunity that could have eliminated poverty in many of those communities within a generation, Mr. Speaker. Exactly. It's sad that the Liberals are heckling in light of some of the language coming from First Nation leaders. Not would suggest a reconciliatory attitude from those members, Mr. Speaker. But this is a pattern. This is a pattern that started going back to 2016, Mr. Speaker, with the Prime Minister. In fact, on his first state visit to Washington, he signed on to an accord with the United States and with President Obama that put a ban on development on 17% of Canada's Arctic landmass and on 10% of Arctic waters. How much consultation was done in conjunction with that? Zero, Mr. Speaker. The Northwest Territories Premier confirmed days after with his disappointment they were not consulted. The First Nations and Inuit of the area were not consulted. Who was trotted out by the Prime Minister's office? the president of the WWF Canada, Mr. Speaker, David Miller, the former mayor of Toronto, they seem to be the only organization in on this ban for our Inuit development opportunities in the North, Mr. Speaker. I would note that a year earlier, the president of that organization was Mr. Butts, who was a principal advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. So zero consultation for Inuit and First Nation leaders in our Arctic and Northwest British Columbia, but lots of consultation with insiders and I would say groups of the left, Mr. Speaker. Why is that important? Because now we see the Prime Minister, his record on economic developments coming home to roost, Mr. Speaker. He unilaterally cut the Northern Gateway project. He killed Energy East through changes to regulation, Mr. Speaker. And now Trans Mountain is on the precipice. In fact, today marks 1 month remaining when Kinder Morgan may be withdrawing their capital investment, having watched 2.5 years of the Liberal government over-regulating, overtaxing, becoming less competitive, and uncertainty on whether they can even get the twinning of their existing line completed, Mr. Speaker. And what is now going to happen with Bill C-48? If Trans Mountain fails, which the government is doing its best, they're even funding protesters through summer jobs grants to make that happen. If it fails, this bill will preclude 31 First Nations from actually coming up with an alternative with Northern Gateway through some of their traditional territories, Mr. Speaker. So the Prime Minister is a master at rhetoric, but he's a disaster at delivery, Mr. Speaker. He talks about consultation and reconciliation and does none of it. I stress that, Mr. Speaker. 17% of the land mass in the Arctic struck away without a phone call, Mr. Speaker. That not only violates what the spirit of reconciliation following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission outlines, Mr. Speaker, it violates Canadian law and case law on the duty to consult, going to from the Sparrow decision to the Delgamu decision, Mr. Speaker, right through to recently last year decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Clyde River matter and the Chippewas of the Thames River, Mr. Speaker, where consultation has to be meaningful to those affected, particularly when it's about the adverse impact of a decision. That's what the duty to consult in Canadian law of our First Nations means. This Prime Minister has failed at every juncture on that duty, Mr. Speaker. He did not consult Chief Derrick, Chief Swampy, Chief Ghostkeeper, when he unilaterally took away an opportunity for 31 First Nation communities to provide opportunities for their people, Mr. Speaker. Where was the consultation? Where was the consultation to our First Nation, Inuit, and territorial leaders when, with the strike of a pen in Washington, he struck away the opportunity for them to provide and make decisions on their own territory, Mr. Speaker? And now with C-48 and with Kinder Morgan teetering on the brink, he's going to block yet another opportunity for Canadians and First Nations to chart their own destiny, Mr. Speaker. So, as I said earlier, apart from the tattoo, I've not seen much commitment from the Prime Minister. In fact, his lack of consultation is insulting, Mr. Speaker. And I've worked on these issues before becoming a parliamentarian. I wasn't a bouncer. I wasn't doing drama. I was working with the Council of Aboriginal Business, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, on trying to provide opportunities by working with the resource industry, Mr. Speaker. And I've been blown away by some tremendous First Nations leaders from across the country who are providing an opportunity for a new story for their people, Mr. Speaker. So not only do we have the Prime Minister who has killed Northern Gateway, killed Energy East, and Trans Mountain is on the brink. I call him the serial pipeline killer, Mr. Speaker. Not only do we have that happening, at the same time that getting our resources to tidewater on our western coast, they're now going to block the opportunity for a new option with this moratorium, Mr. Speaker, ignoring the fact that there's already been a voluntary 100-kilometer exclusion zone between Washington State and Alaska since 1985. So once again, a government that talks a lot about reconciliation, building trust, doesn't even have the courtesy to talk to the First Nation communities that are going to be horribly impacted by their decisions, Mr. Speaker. The next apology I hear in this House of Commons, I would like it to come from this Prime Minister and his terrible decisions with respect to our First Nation.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, truly amazing how the member across the way tries to give a false impression. Never before have we had a Prime Minister that has really done such a fabulous job in terms of trying to build and reestablish a relationship with First Nations people. You know, for years in opposition, for example, I would say to the then Prime Minister Harper,
That's exactly what we're trying to avoid. So if I can encourage the members to listen to the question and listen to the answers, and we'll all be further ahead. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Harper's the Prime Minister. For years, we're saying we want to have a public inquiry on the murdered, missing women and girls, and Harper closed a deaf ear to it, Mr. Speaker. Within months, we had one established. We have a Prime Minister that is committed to truth and reconciliation. All recommendations. What did Harper have to say about it, Mr. Speaker? Well, nothing. You know, when it comes to the issue of the pipelines or the moratorium, on the moratorium issue, this is something in which, after serious consultation with Canadians, we went into an election, we made a commitment. It's a fulfillment of an election, a commitment that we're witnessing here, Mr. Speaker. Only the Conservatives that continue to be out of touch with reality and what Canadians expect of good government to do, want to oppose this bill. For what reason? Because they just want to oppose a bill. They disagree with having a moratorium, and then they try to come up with ideas as to why it is it's not a good government. This is the government that is actually building the pipeline, Mr. Speaker. My question, or I guess more so a comment, and we'll let the member respond to the comments.
Sure.
Mr. Speaker, I'm astounded by that member's comments, not by the volume and number of words he speaks, because he's famous for that, Mr. Speaker. But I talked about how the Prime Minister has provided zero consultation with respect to his unilateral decision on Northern Gateway, zero consultation when he signed away Inuit rights to self-determination on 17% of their lands, right, Mr. Speaker. And he comes back to me and suggests that their consultations was the election. I guess that's what he's saying, Mr. Speaker. I would bet you that they have not consulted the First Nations, the 31 First Nations impacted by the Northern Gateway decision on Bill C-48. But that member seems to think the election writ period qualifies as consultation to our First Nations, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that's not meaningful. I would suggest that falls short of Supreme Court decisions, Mr. Speaker. I think now the second apology I'd like to hear in this House is from that member for that suggestion.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that name is pretty hard to memorize. I want to thank the member from Durham for his comments and his speech, his presentation. Very much appreciate his renewed interest in Indigenous issues in this country. But I want to ask him this question. He refers to those 31 Indigenous communities that have signed agreements. I've looked at the list of those so-called agreements. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the 31 agreements that he refers to are secret, confidential letters of undertaking and memorandums of understanding. I've been in this business for 30 years. Those are not agreements in my mind. Secondly, does the member find these so-called agreements consistent with what the Supreme Court has said in the Haida Nation case, where the Supreme Court said that on important matters, and I would suggest that pipeline is an important matter, on important matters we need the full consent of Indigenous communities. Does he agree?
Member for Durham in 45 seconds or less, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik, because he's shared his perspective in this House on many occasions, and it's appreciated. What I would suggest to him that a 30% equity stake in a pipeline is a substantive agreement, Mr. Speaker. Now, he's suggesting they're not real agreements. An equity stake in a project of that size is significant, Mr. Speaker, and for him to discount it is simply wrong at law. The second point I would point him out to, if we want to debate Supreme Court cases, is I'd refer him to more updated cases from the Supreme Court that I cited, from the Clyde River decision and the Thames, the Chippewa of the Thames River from last year, the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker. They said that duty to consult must be meaningful. Obviously, the Prime Minister's zero consultations doesn't qualify as meaningful, but that consultations are limited in scope. I've said clearly there is no duty to veto projects in Canada, Mr. Speaker, and that doesn't help both First Nations or development of our resources for all Canadians. So we have to engage in pragmatic, positive dialogue that builds partnerships with First Nations. I think he would agree with that. That would agree with the Supreme Court. My highlight tonight is the Prime Minister's unilateral actions in our Arctic and in northwestern British Columbia fall short of the Supreme Court's expectations on Canada.